Good evening. My name is David Schwartz, and as president of PORAT, I welcome you to this program on the future of modern Orthodoxy. PORAT stands for People for Orthodox Renaissance and Torah, and one of the goals of the organization is to bring together lay and religious leaders to discuss modern Orthodoxy and its values. We will be doing exactly that in today's program as we discuss two important topics: the scope of modern Orthodoxy and its content. As we discuss these topics, the definition of modern Orthodoxy will play a central role. And while I will leave that primarily for our panelists, I thought that I would open our event by sharing my definition and why our event this evening is so important. For me, modern Orthodoxy means engaging in a fully observant Orthodox life as governed by the Shulchan Aruch, while at the same time recognizing that secular knowledge and an appreciation of the natural world are important elements for developing a closer relationship with God. Dr. Gillian Steinberg, a teacher at SAR High School, made this point in an article in the journal Conversations. While Dr. Steinberg's article focused on literature, one could apply her words to all of modern thought. To paraphrase, learning about the world makes a fuller, truer observance of Torah possible. It provides access to the sensibilities and sensitivities toward which the Torah guides us to become something better than our current selves. Of course, it is not enough for us to live this philosophy ourselves. We must also convey it to the next generation. As Hashem notes regarding Avraham in last week's Parsha Vayera, Ki yadativ leman asher yitzaveh es banav es ba'iso acharav v'shamru derech Hashem la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. For I know that he will command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of Hashem to do righteousness and justice. It was not enough for Abraham to do righteousness and justice himself. He needed to convey these principles to the next generation. The same can be said of modern Orthodoxy. Hopefully, this event will contribute towards this effort. In this regard, I'm so pleased by the diversity of our registrants. We have people participating who attend Young Israel, OU synagogues, Chabad, and Hillel. We have students and people who have not officially been students for some time. And may we all learn together and from each other this evening. Tonight, we will hear two panels. We begin with the big tent of modern Orthodoxy, which by my definition may be a somewhat ironic title, and then continue with our modern Orthodox lives, practices, values, and needs. We will have a short break between the programs. Please post your questions in the chat, which we will be monitoring throughout, and we will respond to as many as we can during the Q&A portion of each session. We are pleased to offer live closed captioning this evening. To access it, please click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. So let's get our event started, and for that I will turn things over to Rabbi Eitan Cooper, the Assistant Rabbi of Beth Sholom Congregation in Potomac, Maryland. Please go ahead, Rabbi Cooper.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Schwartz. It's good to be here this evening. Erev Tov. I really would like to thank, before we begin, Rabbi David Schwartz and also Rabbi Lauren Berman for helping to organize this amazing event. Of course, I also want to thank our panelists this evening, Dr. Rivka Press Schwartz, Associate Principal at SAR High School, Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank, the Director of Contemporary Jewish Life at AJC, and Rabbi Mark Trencher, the founder of Nishma Research. We're here this evening to talk about modern Orthodoxy, and we'll discuss questions such as how is it defined, how do we interpret and apply that definition. We're also going to touch on some of the challenges that need to be addressed within the modern Orthodox community. Before we address these questions, though, the first question I know I ask myself, and perhaps you might be asking yourselves also, is why now? Why are we having this discussion right now? There's so much else that is on our minds as citizens of the world, with a pandemic raging on, as citizens of our country, and as Jewish people all around the world. Moreover, those who identify as modern Orthodox make up a small, tiny percentage of the Jewish people. The nuances of this discussion that we're going to have tonight are almost certainly only ones that will resonate amongst a small group of adherents to this denomination. the vast majority of others in the Jewish world, to put it bluntly, probably don't care. So why focus on this discussion? Why at this time? And you might ask, why at any time? It's because this discussion really is a timeless one, discussing our identity, how we interact with the modern world, and who we, quote unquote, are as a community is of the utmost importance. This conversation forms a sort of Torah that sustains us intellectually, even as it frustrates some of us spiritually or may be foreign to others. So in just a moment, we'll turn our attention to our panelists. I do want to note before we begin that all of the panelists did have access to these questions, but this discussion you're going to see unfold was not planned, and you're going to witness right now a discussion that hopefully is natural and authentic in that sense. So the first part of our discussion that we'll have this evening is about the definition of modern orthodoxy. Really central in our discussion of modern orthodoxy is defining what it is precisely, or at least as best we can. So our panelists are going to weigh in on this question, and I want to start with perhaps some statistics. To ground us as we begin this conversation, I'd like to turn to Mark Trencher, whose recent study of the modern Orthodox community was one of a kind. I'd love, Mark, if you can share with us some of the most important data points for us to be aware of when it comes to the modern Orthodox community.
Sure, thank you very much, Eitan. So we've actually done 6 surveys of the modern Orthodox community, and we have a lot of information. So these are just a few of the highlights about our community. So let me just back up a little bit and talk about, as Eitan mentioned, we're a very small community. The world Jewish population is 15 million, of which about 7 million Jews in the United States. Those 7 million, only about 850,000 are Orthodox. Now that includes the Haredi, which are the Hasidic and the Yeshivish, and actually there's almost twice as many Haredi Orthodox Jews in the US as there are modern Orthodox Jews. So what is the actual number of modern Orthodox Jews in the US? It's about 300,000. Now that might sound like a large number. It's less than 0.1% of the US population. Yes, it's true that we're disproportionately influential in a number of areas, but we are a very, very tiny group, a very tiny group. I used to tell, when I spoke in shuls, I used to say, you could take all of the modern Orthodox community, everybody you know, and every shul and every yeshiva, and fit them all into 5 National Football League stadiums on a Sunday afternoon. And that would be everybody. Of course, these days, you'd probably take many more stadiums because of the isolation. But I came across an interesting statistic that I really think kind of emphasizes how small we are. And that is the number of transgender people in the United States is 5 times as many as the number of modern Orthodox Jews, which is kind of interesting. But again, it reinforces that we're small. One of the points we're going to be making in tonight's program is about this big tent. I call it the smallest big tent that's around, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So what is modern Orthodoxy? Before we get into its definition, I just want to make one very important point. In the first survey we did, I wanted to get a sense of how important is our modern Orthodoxy to us as individuals. And I was going to ask a very complicated question of people saying, you know, you're a father, you're a mother, you're a sister, brother, you might be a doctor, lawyer, you might be a teacher. Where does your Orthodox observance, where does your Jewishness fit into all the components that make you who you are? Of course, that was a very complicated question, which we ended up not asking, but I asked a different question. The question I asked people was, on a scale from 0 to 10, because researchers like to talk about scales from 0 to 10, how important is your being an Orthodox observant Jew as a part of your life? On a scale from 0 to 10. So 0 would mean it's not really an important part of my life. 5 would be in between. 10, yes, it's a very critical part of my life. In the business world, ratings of 9 or 10 are really the numbers that people look to for strong connection. And about 3/4 of the people said 9 or 10. So 3/4 of American modern Orthodox Jews feel that their Orthodox Judaism is a very important part of who they are. In the business world, ratings of 8 or 7, those are called passives. You know, it's good. The glass is half full, the glass is half empty. They're connected, but not as strongly. So about another 18%. One of the questions I get asked sometimes is, what is the at-risk factor? Because you hear about people leaving Orthodoxy. Within the modern Orthodox community, are there people that are at risk of leaving? And using this question, in the business world, ratings of 654 and lower, those are called detractors. Those are the kind of people that if you ask them to rate your insurance company, they would get online and say, I'm not sticking with this company. I don't like their service. So if you add up all the people who gave ratings from 6 down to 0, it's about 10%. So I could say that about 10%, about 1 in 10 American modern Orthodox Jews is not connected. The percentage is about the same for men and for women. There are some variations by age, and there's a lot more here than I can cover in just one brief talk. We also asked people an interesting question, and that is, we asked people, what are the things that give you, as a modern Orthodox Jew, what are the things that give you the most satisfaction, joy, or meaning as an Orthodox observant Jew? This was an open-ended question, which means we didn't give them a checklist. We just said, tell us in your own words, what are the things that make you love being Orthodox? And when I ask this in shuls, the number one thing that I ask people to guess, and often people will guess, the number one thing people guess is Shabbos, Shabbat. And then I say, no, that was number 2 on the list. And learning was number 6 on the list. Connection to Hashem, service to Hashem was number 5 on the list. And finally, somebody says sense of community. The sense of community is very, very strong. I can't compare it to other elements of the Orthodox community. My sense is it's equally strong in the Hasidic world, if not even more so. And it's also pretty strong in the yeshivish world. When this question was asked of Mormons, the results were very similar to what we found in our survey. Sense of community was way ahead of theological and observance issues. So we have to remember that's strong, because one of the things we're going to talk about, the connection, we'll also raise this in the context of the pandemic and whether there's been any interesting changes that might emerge from the pandemic. Okay, so you might remember there was a survey in 2013, the Pew survey, and there was one chart in the Pew survey that when I looked at it, I said to myself, this cannot be right. This has got to be wrong. And it was a chart that showed people who were raised Orthodox, how many of them remain Orthodox at various points in their lives. So how many of them remain Orthodox at age 30, at age 50, at age 70? And the numbers, and I looked at the numbers and I said, you're telling me that for people who were raised Orthodox, by the time they're in their mid-50s, only 40% of them are still Orthodox? But if you look at the entire chart, and it goes through other denominations as well, the one thing that came across was just a huge amount of fluidity. So when I grew up in Brooklyn, if you were a Hasidic Jew, that's what you were. If you were Yeshivish, that's what you were. If you were an American-born Jew, I grew up in a not an American Jewish household. If you were an American Jew, that's what you were. And over time, I've come to realize, and the research shows this, that there's just a lot of fluidity. Part of it is the society we live in. It's a society of individual choice. We choose what we want to be like, and that choice extends to our Jewishness as well. I will mention also that both the Pew survey and my survey found that approximately 40% of modern Orthodox Jews are Baalei Tshuva. The last point I'll make, and I'll show a slide on this, is so when I did my survey, I said, are you Orthodox? Yes. And then I asked people, are you modern Orthodox or Yeshivish or Hasidic? And people answered that. And then to the people who said that they were modern Orthodox, for the people who said they were Orthodox, I said to them, are you modern Orthodox? And people that I was testing the survey before it went out, and I asked this of people that I knew were clearly modern Orthodox, and they gave me some really strange answers. People said, I don't really consider myself modern Orthodox because, and one woman said, because I don't wear pants, and people said different things. And it became apparent that the term modern, and the word modern is an adjective, which might have positive or negative connotations to it. It became apparent that people didn't all view the term modern Orthodox the same way. That might be why you, Rabbi Lamb, started calling it centrist Orthodox. Centrist is positional. We're in the middle. Modern is modern. Some people view it negatively, but the question I asked, it was very simply, within that spectrum, where do you view yourself? And I gave people 5 choices. Are you open Orthodox or liberal modern Orthodox? And 1/3 of the people put themselves in that left side. Are you modern Orthodox? And about 40% put themselves in the middle. Are you centrist Orthodox or right-leaning centrist tending toward yeshivish? That last one was kind of a descriptive mouthful, but 1/4 put themselves in that group. So my observations were, first of all, there is a spectrum. There is a pretty wide spectrum. Second observation was that 93% of the people were able to answer this question without really any further definition. I did not need to define liberal modern Orthodox or modern Orthodox or centrist. People have a sense of where they fit. People knew where they fit and they were able to answer the questions. A few people said, I belong to all of these groups, which is kind of interesting. I'd like to meet those people. Some people said, I don't like labels, which is understandable. And a handful of people said, I don't know. But the fact is the spectrum is wide. It's almost like a bell curve. People know where they fit. And all of the questions that we asked and all of the surveys after that, we always slice it by these 5 groups. The question being, how different are they? And I think that's one of the things that we'll talk about tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, so much for that grounding and really helpful information. Laura, I want to turn to you for a second. And I'm wondering if you could situate us historically. I'm curious if we actually have any idea where the term modern orthodoxy, quote unquote, was first used. And if we do know what, when it was first used, what did it mean then? And in your opinion, has this definition of modern Orthodox, quote unquote, has it changed over time?
Sure. Okay. So first of all, I just want to start by saying thank you to PORAT and to Rabbi David Schwartz for organizing this series of panels. And thank you so much to you, Rabbi Cooper, and this whole panel. It's really an honor to be with all of you today. So when was the term modern Orthodoxy first used? I want to actually start, it's a complicated question, and I'm going to try to hit that sweet spot between being nuanced and being concise. So I'll do my best. I want to, first of all, just unpack the term orthodoxy for a second. So when we often think about our ancestors, the idealized kind of the pious Yidden of Europe as being Orthodox Jews, but they themselves would never have used the term Orthodox because Orthodox is only in contradistinction to something else. The term orthodoxy means an authorized theory or doctrine or practice. So the concept of a Judaism that is orthodox could only emerge when there was another type of Judaism, one which certain religious leaders had an interest in labeling non-authorized, if you will. So in pre-modern times, that type of Judaism didn't exist, and Jews were traditionally observant and religious. And there was no need to have a type of Judaism that proclaimed itself to be the authorized type. And that all changed in the 19th century with the birth of Reform Judaism in Germany and in America. And Reform Judaism arose in a time where Jews were seeking to both fit into the society around them and also kind of stanch the flow of Jews who were leaving Judaism due to a very kind of enticing external culture. And the Reform movement engaged in a number of changes to Judaism, which I won't detail because in the interest of time, but they had some changes that they kind of considered to be more aesthetic changes, like having the rabbi give a sermon in the vernacular or having a choir, those kinds of things. And there also were ideological changes, ideological changes like erasing all references to Messiah from the liturgy, or saying that Jewish law was no longer binding, Jewish ritual law was no longer binding. And then there was a cadre of rabbis in Germany who were very upset with this ideological change, feeling that they were actually, that Judaism was actually being endangered by these reformers. But they also believed that modernity was important and that even critical things could come from modernity to help Judaism. And those rabbis, 2 of whom were Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and Rabbi Ezrael Hildesheimer, founded a new type of Judaism, new kind of movement that kind of moved itself away from reform, and it came to be known as neo-Orthodoxy. So I know I'm not yet at modern Orthodoxy, but I'll be there in a second. And the ideology of German neo-Orthodoxy is often encapsulated in the famous statement of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, Torah im derech eretz, Torah with the way of the land. And he really believed that secular education had a great deal to offer and was valuable in and of itself. And he was also in favor of incorporating various other cultural elements of the external world, sort of those aesthetic reforms that the Reform movement believed in as well. But while it did have a powerful influence on our American modern Orthodoxy, it's not really the same as our modern Orthodoxy, the one that developed in America, which I'm now going to turn to. Neo-Orthodoxy was not Zionist. And I think, as I'm going to get to in a second, that was one of the really defining themes of modern Orthodoxy in America. And second of all, Neo-Orthodoxy was pretty separatist. They were not very excited to integrate with other Jewish communities like the Reform, to be specific. They really didn't want to work with the Reform movement. And one of the hallmarks of modern Orthodoxy in America has been its willingness to work in certain respects with non-Orthodox Jews. So now to get more specifically to your question, Eitan, the term modern Orthodoxy, qua modern Orthodoxy, was first used at some point in America in the post-Civil War era, sometime between 1865 and let's say 1880, sometime in there. The American Jewish community was pretty small during this time. There were about 150,000 Jews in America in the Civil War. It was about 250,000 by 1880. And the Jews who came to America in the 19th century, they were kind of pasha to Yidden in many ways. They weren't very educated secularly or Jewishly, particularly in the earlier part of the century. And they were really willing to go to a country that was kind of a Jewish wasteland. So they didn't really think that, living in like a rich, like very Jewishly structured community wasn't so important to them. So they were kind of willing to make allowances when they got here to fit into their surroundings. So they had Orthodox shuls, what we would consider to be Orthodox shuls, but they would go to work on Saturday, or they would, they wouldn't eat pork, but they would eat beef that wasn't shechted according to the laws of kashrut. And as the century went on, more Jews came that were more educated, rabbis came, and some of those rabbis were reformers who brought their ideas about ideological reform. So the Reform movement kind of was born out of these people who were kind of lax about observance, but also ideologically committed to reform. That's reform. So now the Orthodox who are going to draw away from that, there were a number of Jews, even though the majority of Jews in America, by the time you get to 1880, are Reform, who felt that reform had gone too far. Reform in America was quite radical, and they just felt it had gone too far. And they just wanted to feel like a traditional Jewish synagogue again, something that wasn't ultra-Orthodox, something that wasn't reform. They wanted something in the middle. And they used the term modern Orthodox to describe themselves. There was not really a philosophy attached to that modern Orthodox. It was a very kind of a vague, nebulous term. And it really wasn't until after the Second World War in the 20th century that the modern Orthodox community sort of coalesced around a series of principles and kind of ideologies that we kind of commonly share, that secular culture has intrinsic value, secular education in particular, a staunch commitment to Zionism, and openness to cooperation with non-Orthodox Jews, and an understanding that it needed to grapple with the role of women in traditional Judaism. And just one last thing I wanted to mention is that another way that modern Orthodoxy has really changed its definition is that, whereas before it was kind of like people who were just seeking out, in the 19th century, seeking out a traditional Jewish space, those Jews were not all that well educated Jewishly. And we have an incredibly well-educated modern Orthodox community today. The day school movement that took off in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s has really changed the framework of what it looks like to be a modern Orthodox Jew in America, starting with my generation. I think it's kind of a birthright of almost all modern Orthodox Jews to go to a Jewish day school and to have a really rich and really deep Jewish education. Of course, also at the same time, I think that modern Orthodoxy has changed in the sense that it's really grappling with a modern world that's outside its framework, that's much more complicated for a religious movement to grapple with than ever before. So I think that ideologically it's changed, educationally it's changed. That sense of wanting a traditional space has kind of remained the same.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. I think that's actually a great segue into my next question for you, Rivka. Just thinking about your experiences, your professional experiences, your personal experiences, Rivka, I'm curious, on the ground right now, what do you see as sort of the primary characteristics, if you had to describe them, of somebody who defines themselves as part of a modern Orthodox institution?
I'm going to give you an answer that sounds tautological. I guess it is tautological, but then I'll explain to you why I think it's actually a meaningful answer. I think the primary characteristic of someone who defines themselves as modern Orthodox is that they define themselves as modern Orthodox. I want to tell you a little bit about what I mean by that. There are plenty of people who define modern Orthodoxy ideologically, and I think both Laura and Mark have spoken at points about that, whether it's about Zionism or the role of women or the openness to secular education and the world. Certainly in my own story of my own journey to modern Orthodoxy from the yeshivish world that I grew up in, it was very much about that for myself personally. But there's also, of course, the social aspect of modern Orthodoxy, which I didn't experience. I didn't do the modern Orthodox summer camp or the modern Orthodox day school. That wasn't the story of my own life, but there are people for whom those are deep and profound formative experiences and shape their connection to the community. And I think it took me a while to realize that it's not like there's a good way to be modern Orthodox, which is, I believe, the list of things that modern Orthodox people believe. Rabbi Saul Berman almost 20 years ago wrote an article laying out 9 core beliefs of modern Orthodoxy. And it's a great article on the great 9 core beliefs. But it's not as though if you don't check off those 9 as these are deep, well-articulated convictions that I hold, then you're not a good modern Orthodox Jew. If you say, I was educated in the schools, I went to the summer camps, I live in the community, I daven in the shuls, and those are formative experiences for me. That being immersed, as Mark said, to us in this community and being connected to the network and the web of this community, and that's what matters to me. You know, I think I probably used to think sort of snobbily, like that was, you know, a second-class way of being modern Orthodox, and it was better to be modern Orthodox out of some kind of ideological conviction. And now I think that there are a broad range of ways that people connect to religion and connect to community. And for some of us, it's because we read texts and we studied books and we engage with ideas. And for other people, it's that lived experience of what, and obviously it's not that binary, right? It can be the books and the summer camp. I don't mean to sound like it's that binary, but there are many different ways that people can find meaning and connection, religious meaning, community, as part of the modern Orthodox world. And so I think ultimately what makes you modern Orthodox is that you decide to call yourself modern Orthodox. And there are going to be some people who say, I check off 8 things on that list, or 7 or 9, or I never think about that list at all. But I'm in this community because I'm in it, and then you're in it.
Great. Thank you, Rivka. So we've arrived at one of our sort of not totally planned portions of our discussion this evening, where I'm going to ask if any of the panelists here have any reactions or responses to what anybody has said thus far before we move on to the next portion of our discussion.
I just want to say that I think that what Rivka just said is so amazing because it's so modern, right? Like the concept that you want to be part of a community, so you're part of the community. And I think that that's actually something that's very, that to me feels very meaningful and very true to the way the modern Orthodox community is structured in America today. And I think that it's kind of, its roots were sort of that way as well. It was very much a group of people who decided that they fit together for whatever reasons, and ideology is a piece of it, and community is a piece of it, and it's complicated. But I love that modern suggestion of, you know, you're part of the community because you want to be.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next portion of our discussion, which is the big tent of modern Orthodoxy. So as we've noted so far, there are many people who call themselves modern Orthodox. That might mean, it might mean something different to different people. And as a result, there could be many modern Orthodox communities that call themselves modern Orthodox, but in reality could look somewhat different on the ground experientially. So Rivka, I'm going to turn to you again first here. I'm curious to what extent you believe this is a challenge to modern Orthodoxy. In other words, is it okay that many people have different ideas of what it means to identify as modern Orthodox.
Thank you so much for offering me a soapbox on which I can discourse about my favorite topic. Okay, maybe it's not my favorite topic, but it's up there on the list. I've spent a lot of time these past 4 years thinking about citizenship in America in general, and in the modern Orthodox community in particular. And that reflection, study, work was very much born out of a reaction to seeing our community in the wake of the 2016 presidential election and thinking about that. And here's a thing that I came to realize. Sociologists have described American societies increasingly sorting by political views. You associate with, live with, spend time with people who think the way you do. And I came to realize that the big modern Orthodox high schools are trying to do something that actually there aren't that many institutions in American life that are actively trying to do, which is to bring together people of very different political views into the same place because we're united by something else, which is our religious commitments, our religious affiliations. And that's actually just an example or a microcosm, not microcosm is probably not the right word there, but that's an example of other ways in which we have difference or disagreement about things, and we're trying to hold ourselves together in community. In a lot of the rest of the United States of America, there's a sorting and a separating and a dividing out and a building of walls or drawing of lines. And I have to say in large parts of the Orthodox community, there's a similar kind of thing. Okay, you've now said X, you're now trafe, outside the line, outside the camp, outside the tent. And I think that figuring out how to be in community with people with whom we disagree about important things is itself A, very valuable exercise, B, builds our character, but C, should be part of what modern Orthodoxy is. Because to believe there's only one right way, and if you don't do it the right way, you're wrong and you should be out. That certainly is a point of view, but I don't think that's a modern Orthodox point of view. I think a modern Orthodox point of view admits that there are multiple possible approaches to ways of thinking about an issue. And if I think that, then I don't think that somebody who thinks differently than I do, has to be run out of town on a rail. And so I actively want to push back on that idea that holding a multiplicity of views about whatever issue, again, I gave American politics as an example, but I want to be clear that it's only an example. I think our community has to be able to have people who have different views about whatever the issue is. How we think about and relate to the state of Israel, the role of women within Orthodoxy, how Orthodox Jews should function as American citizens, choose your own adventure. And whatever that issue is, we need to figure out how to say, I disagree with you. I think you're wrong. But I can hear the values you're coming from, and I can tell you the values that I'm coming from, instead of having a conversation in which if you disagree with me, you're either stupid, evil, or in it for the money. And so I think that having that larger tent is not just a strength of modern Orthodoxy, it's constitutive of modern Orthodoxy. That should be what it means to be modern Orthodox, that we think there's more than one possible way of thinking about something, and we are able to hear and learn from and engage with somebody who thinks about things differently than we do.
Thank you so much for that. And before I get to my next question, I just want to remind everybody watching that you can, and we encourage you to write questions in the chat window. You can write them publicly, and we'll try to answer them at the end of this portion of the event. I want to turn now to you, Mark, for a moment, and I'm curious if in any of your research you've encountered or asked about the term social orthodoxy. And maybe you could even pause for a minute and describe what you see this phenomenon to be, if you've seen it in your research, and what place social orthodoxy has within the broader spectrum of modern orthodoxy. And Mark, when you're done answering that, I'd love, Laura, if we could hear any comments you have on social orthodoxy as well.
Sure. So when I do my surveys, I ask people, are you Orthodox, Conservative, Reform? If they say I'm Orthodox, I ask them, are you modern Orthodox? And people say yes or no. People have told me that they're socially Orthodox. People have said I'm Orthoprax, I'm Conservadox, I'm Flexodox. We have a lot of labels, traditional egalitarian. Somebody came over to me in a shul. I gave a presentation in a shul in Massachusetts and said, your numbers are all messed up because you're including in your group that you say are modern Orthodox people. There are clearly people in that group that are not modern Orthodox and that are not even Orthodox. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I was talking to somebody who said I'm Orthodox, and I noticed that he wasn't wearing tzitzis. I said, well, that person is not Orthodox. I said, okay, look, There's two ways to decide who's modern Orthodox. One is you can give them a litmus test and ask them about Shabbos and kosher and this and that, and you make a decision as to what they are. But essentially, we let people self-define. The person who says, I am modern Orthodox, we view them as modern Orthodox, regardless of their beliefs and practices to some extent. So for example, we asked people who said, I'm modern Orthodox, do you believe that Hashem created the world, that God created the world? To what extent do you believe it? And 90% believe this, 90%, which means 10% said, I either have doubts.
I don't know that one.
That was Alexa. I either have doubts, or I don't know, or I just don't believe. But they say they're modern Orthodox. So are they socially Orthodox? Is it that they value the community more? Maybe they love davening. We asked people, do you observe Shabbos? And 91% said, yes, I observe it strictly or mostly, which means 9% said they don't. So one of the things we need to appreciate is among people who view themselves as Orthodox and who said they're modern Orthodox, 100% are not on the same page when you ask them about Hashem's influence on their lives on a day-to-day basis. Only 76% believe Hashem is involved in their lives on a day-to-day basis. In the yeshivish world, that's up in the 90s. We asked about another area. We asked about kashrus. 90% are kosher. 10% not so much. We asked about men about davening with tefillin on a regular basis, and about 1 in 4 said they don't. The point I was trying to make is that we accept people within our big tent, and we don't ask them these questions about what they practice on a day-to-day basis. So the social Orthodox are part of the modern Orthodox, as are the other groups. And we just need to appreciate that there is a huge variation. There's a huge variation in beliefs and practices and how people live their lives. There's also a huge variation in the blending of the Orthodox and the modern. So for some people, the religious observance might be a key important part of their lives, and they accommodate modernity and interaction with society. For other people, the interaction with society is an important part of their lives, and they're fitting their Jewishness into that. All of these things make up the big tent. Thank you.
So I'll say that, I think we've mentioned already a couple of times that the modern Orthodox community, religious communities, or all different types of communities that human beings get involved in, they speak very much about the human desire to connect. And if you're someone who fits in, and I want to be mindful now by saying that there are many who don't feel that they fit into modern Orthodox communities and wouldn't feel that a modern Orthodox community is serving their communal needs. I'm thinking in particular about LGBTQ Jews, Jews of color, and other people as well who don't fit into whatever box the modern Orthodox community has. But if you do fit in, so to speak, then it's a wonderful place to live, a modern Orthodox community. It's warm, it's embracing, it's supportive, there's chesed, there's Shabbat meals, there's a built-in social structure, there's built-in friends, you're unplugged once a week, it's wonderful. So you can see why it is appealing to someone who's not necessarily thinking about God every day, or who doesn't put on tefillin every day, or whatever it is, to want to be a part of that community if there's someone who feels attached to or connected to a traditional religious framework, and it feels warmth toward it, and feels that they themselves, because of their family constellation or their personal constellation of structure, family structure, whatever, fits in. I also want to say that I think that probably more Jews than we think in the modern Orthodox community are socially Orthodox, in the sense that they're not strictly keeping every element of the Shulchan Aruch the way they're supposed to. And we do have this set of communal norms, as Mark mentioned, keeping Shabbos, keeping kosher. I actually think sending your kids to day school is a third communal norm. I don't necessarily know that Taharat HaMishpacha is a communal norm. I don't know if you asked that question, Mark, on the survey. I would like to know what the answer was there. But I think that what happens behind closed doors in the Orthodox community, what happens in people's own kitchens, and also what happens between one modern Orthodox community and another modern Orthodox Orthodox community can be very, very different. And so, I think that we sometimes kind of wring our hands about this social orthodoxy thing, and oh my God, and we don't observe halacha in our community, and it's so awful, and what are we going to do? And the truth is, yes, it's a problem for sure. I think that it's probably a much more widespread issue than we think it is. And I think, just to go back to what Rivka said before, I'm not sure that gatekeeping about it is the answer. I don't really think that would necessarily solve any issue. I think that we have to have a big tent.
Yeah, by the way, we did ask the question just very quickly of men and women, married men and women, Taharat Mishpacha. 58% said I observe it strictly. Another 22% said mostly. For those of us who know what the mostly means, mostly can be anything, but 80% observed Taharat Mishpacha. 20% said not really. So, yeah.
Fascinating. Laura, I just want to jump on one thing you said there, which is, again, to go back to this idea of seeing social orthodoxy, which is orthodoxy through connection to community, as kind of being a lesser than, a watered down form of orthodoxy. And I want to be transparent, about the mea culpa here. I am sure that is how I thought about it the first time that I read Lefkowitz's article about social orthodoxy, whenever it came out, however many years ago. And I think about it differently now, and maybe I think about it differently because I've grown up a little more. But maybe I also think about it differently because I have a 20-year-old son whose permission I have to talk about him on this. And my son goes to shul every Shabbos and deeply connects with a community of men that he's with in shul. And I don't know if he goes into the sanctuary at all or for how long or how many words he says, and is deeply committed to and connected to Jewish community through the participation in that community of the men he's in a minyan with, where I really don't know how much actual saying of the words of davening he's doing. So like the standard thing to do would be to say, oh, that's less good, less connected, less orthodox. Really? How many members of the community are there whose orthodoxy is lived that way? And it's not just about, the kugel or it's about a deep form of a connection. It's about a connection that takes place in a religious space around religious activities, even if one is not meaningfully communing with God. And as Laura referenced, right, our ancestors back in Europe, really how many of them were deeply communing with God every time they prayed? They were deeply embedded in a community that was a web that was so rich and so tightly woven and held them together. And the older I get, the more I'm willing to say that is a perfectly, yes, of course, we want halachic observance and the Shulchan Aruch, and I will keep teaching that to my students and my children. I will keep pushing for that. But to act as though people whose Judaism is formed and maintained and held in that other way, through that embeddedness in that web of connections, like that's somehow lesser. That's how Orthodox Judaism is meant to be lived. And I think we've all seen that through the counterexample, which is the last however many months of our lives, when everything was completely disrupted. And we spent however long it was. I'm in the SAR community. We were in the first schools on the East Coast to be quarantined for COVID. We spent Purim at home alone. And then of course, everybody was at home alone, and Pesach. And I don't have to tell you what the next bunch of months of our lives looked like. And I think many of us realized it wasn't just that there weren't the formalities of a minyan or laning or Tefillin Shebek Kedusha. It was also that a really important part of what our Jewish life was fundamentally disrupted. And I guess this is to say I'm becoming less snobby, more tolerant, more appreciating the diversity of the community in my middle age, however exactly you like to put it, to say that those Jews for whom their Judaism is deeply anchored in connection to the Jewish community, rather than, we're a community, honestly, we're a community that's molded in the image of the Rav, in the image of Rav Soloveitchik. And so a certain kind of text-based hyper-intellectualism becomes the ideal way to experience and practice religion. And probably the people who are good at that and like that become the rabbis and become the Torah teachers and pass on that model. And although, we're not really talking about it now, it may be that the whole neo-Hasidic revolution is a whole bunch of people saying, we have other ways of connecting religiously, and it's not going to be angsting over, the lonely man of faith, and you got to give us something else here. And I find that the older I get, the more I'm willing to say there have to be multiple ways and multiple paths. There's not only one way. And that's what I would call the strong form of social orthodoxy. Not social orthodoxy as a less than, but social orthodoxy is a really meaningful way of connecting to and accessing the Jewish community.
Thank you so much to all of you for answering that question in such an articulate way. I want to turn now, and I want to address what I think some of our viewers might be feeling, and maybe what some of you as our panelists might be feeling. It's a bit of an uncomfortable question, but some people might view this very panel and this discussion as not being fully representative of a big tent of modern orthodoxy. There are likely some types of people or viewpoints that are missing in this very discussion. And I imagine this is really symptomatic potentially of a greater issue within the modern Orthodox community, which to some extent has become increasingly siloed and fragmented over the last many years. So I'm curious, and this actually may be the hardest question that I may ask tonight, to what extent do any of you feel you have an idea of how to solve this issue? We're such a small community, as has already been noted. How do we create a greater sense of unity and cohesion within the modern Orthodox community?
So I'll say something on that. So one of the talks I've given is along the lines of, can you handle the truth? Can you handle the truth? And one rabbi of a shul actually knew the movie that came from, because I have found, there's a lot of research in Jewish community. We're asking people for their opinions on issues, but to some extent, people want to manage the message. So not everybody is really open. Historically, we've never been kind of the community that's bottom up, that we're going to listen to what the people say. We've always been kind of a top down in terms of direction. It comes from the rabbis, from the Rosh Yeshiva, from the Rabbanim. But I think in the modern society, we're entering an era in which we really there's a growing understanding that there are opinions out there that we should listen to and that we need to take into account. So I think on the one hand, what you're saying is true, but on the other hand, people are increasingly open to some extent to hearing what other people are saying about various issues. And my hope is, the reason I named my research from Nishma, which means to listen, is because essentially we need to really listen to each other. Programs like this are an opportunity to share what we think, what people that might have views that are a little bit different from the people that are listening to the program think, and to open up the conversation. We live in a society, you mentioned neo-Hasidism, we live in a society where Judaism has multiplied in terms of the different ways it's practiced, different practices, as well as at the same time, we live in a society that is hugely open to personal choice. You can be who you want to be. People become modern Orthodox and then they end up becoming yeshivish or Hasidic. It's just a lot of flux. That essentially is at the core of the big tent. Are we going to continue to be a big tent? And how broad a tent are we going to be? So these are all through listening to each other. So far to date, people with a few minorities, people do appreciate that within modern Orthodoxy, there is a variation in beliefs, practices, and worldviews, and there is acceptance of people that are not exactly the same as you are.
I want to say that there's something that we can do and something that we can't do. Here's what I can't do. Those people who want to say that I'm outside the tent because of my beliefs or my positions or whatever, I can't change that. It's not in my power to change that. There are going to be people who say that because of things I say or do or beliefs I hold or people I'm willing to associate with, I am outside the circle of acceptability. And I don't just mean the Haredi world, I mean within the broad centrist to modern Orthodox world. But here's something that I see, and here's something I would really like to caution against. I see a kind of reciprocal delegitimation. Oh yeah? You say I'm not okay because I take stance X on issue Y? Well, I'm going to say you're equally illegitimate. Here's the problem with that, okay? The person who's saying that I'm outside the camp because of the position that I am taken, they have subscribed to a view of like drawing circles and throwing people out of the camp. So it perfectly makes sense for them to draw a circle and toss me out. That's fine. But I keep saying I believe in modern Orthodoxy. I keep saying that I believe that there are multiple different paths or ways, that there are different ways to think about this, that there's not only one singular possible right answer and everyone else is, what do we say, evil, stupid, or in it for the money. And if that's the case, then I can't engage in that reciprocal delegitimation. I can't say, oh yeah, you think I'm unacceptable? Well, I think you're unacceptable too. I can say, I acknowledge that you're coming from a value system that holds dear to traditional Jewish teachings and practices in a way that you think that what I say is a threat. I understand that you find me threatening or scary. I still value what you value because I also value traditional Jewish practices and teachings. So even though you're going to say, I'm not okay, I'm not going to turn around and say back, you're not okay. And that's how I'm actually going to practice and live the modern orthodoxy that I'm preaching, instead of this, you know, you call me a feminist out to undermine Judaism, I call you a troglodyte trying to drag women back into the cave, whatever it is, and there we are. And there goes the discourse. And it's very hard to do, because when somebody's calling you all kinds of names or delegitimating you, there's a lot of temptation to turn around and delegitimate back. But here's the thing, they say they believe in delegitimation, so it makes sense for them to delegitimate. And I say that I believe that there's not only one possible path or one possible way, so I'm betraying my principles if I turn around and engage in reciprocal delegitimation. And it's not an easy thing to do. There's a reason why Chazal say, "Hane'elavim ve'inam olvim," those who are insulted and don't insult back. "Shom'im cherpatam ve'inam meshivim," who hear their shame and don't respond. Aleihem hakatuv omer, about them the pasuk says, "Ve'ohavav kitzeit hashemesh b'gvurato." Those who love Hashem are like the sun coming out in its full glory. You're called, you love Hashem if you can listen to somebody calling you names and not respond. It's that hard. Okay, but that's a thing to aspire to.
That makes a ton of sense to me. I want to say that, kind of building on what Rivka just said, I think that it's really important for us to, and I'm also coming from the perspective of Rivka saying that, you know, I do think that we shouldn't be engaging in this gatekeeping, and that we should be an inclusive community that recognize, and that Mark said as well, that we're a community that is quite diverse, and that, well, you know, I honor that, and I think that that's a good thing. I think it's important to honor the struggle, and I think that if we could all kind of lower our stress at trying to deal with others who have these other opinions than we do, I think that would be helpful. That's kind of impossible to do in America in the 21st century. But I also think that pretending that problems don't exist is not helpful, or engaging in apologetics about the problems that do exist is not helpful. And I think that sometimes we just have to be like brave enough to say, I don't know what the answer is about women in Orthodox Judaism. I don't know what the answer is about how we're going to deal with gay Jews in Orthodox Judaism. And we're coming at this with great yirat shamayim and great love for halacha and for Torah and for tradition, and at the same time, great love for these fellow Jews. And a great understanding that in the modern world that we live in, that we as modern Orthodox Jews believe is important and relevant and has things that are central to say to us, we have to address these issues. Do we know what the right path is? This person says this way is the only right way. This person says that way is the only right way. I think we have to be unafraid to say, I don't know, and we're going to work together. And we're going to figure it out, and it's going to take time. And in some ways, like, that's a very bottom-up kind of thing to say. And I, just to echo what Mark was saying, that we have traditionally, Judaism was kind of a top-down rabbis, although it wasn't really. I mean, if you read a lot of good Jewish history books, you find that Judaism was actually always a little bit bottom-up. I think, we can honor that bottom-up notion of where we are, and muddle our way through together.
Thank you all. I want us to turn to the last portion of our discussion, which is really, I want us to take a sort of view from 30,000 feet to take a step back and look at the big picture. I'm going to ask a question for each of you. I guess, Mark, you could go first, and then Laura, and then Rivka, and that's how we'll wrap up. And a reminder again to post your questions in the chat window if you have any, and we'll get to those at the end as well. So I'm curious if each of you can speak to these two questions. Where do you hope we are headed as a modern Orthodox community? Where do you hope we are headed as a modern Orthodox community? And what is preventing us, if anything, from getting there? Where do you hope we are headed, and what, if anything, is preventing us from getting there?
Okay, so the tension of modern Orthodoxy is that we are the only group that has as its modus operandi, we are embedded in secular culture, society, knowledge. That's not true of the insular groups. They have very little use for secular culture. They stay away from it. And it's also not true of the non-Orthodox groups that have less connection to Orthodoxy. But we're trying to balance those two things. And being 0.1% of the American society, I heard on a podcast, somebody said, in a battle between religious observance and modernity, the best you can hope for is a tie. The best you can hope for is a tie. Because there are issues out there in society that are important issues, and we need to think about whether that's an issue that affects us. The issue in the past decade that has had the most fundamental shift in society as a whole is the acceptance of LGBTQ and their rights and accepting them as members of society. When I asked this question of modern Orthodox Jews, and the question I asked was, do you support LGBTQ people as members of your shul? Like anyone else, a member of your shul. And about 60% support that. 60% said yes. Even in the most right-leaning group, people who said, I am right-leaning modern Orthodox tending toward yeshivish, even there, 1 out of 4 said, yes, I accept that. So here you have an example of a situation where seemingly the values of society are, at least to some extent, being adopted by the modern Orthodox community. And it hasn't fractured us. I mean, somebody called me and said, that's not the question you need to ask. You need to ask whether the shul should celebrate, what the position is on gay marriage. I said, listen, one step at a time, one step at a time. So I mean, what the challenge of the big tent of modern Orthodoxy in America is the fact that we are in a culture that has values that are different from ours. How can do we accommodate those values? Do we accommodate those values? To what extent do we have women in shuls, in positions connected to the rabbinic function with some type of title? Do you support women having the right to have positions in the shul, not as the administrative assistant, but as something that clearly they have a title that signifies that they have rabbinic authority? I'll put that in quotes, rabbinic authority. And 20%, of course, all of modern Orthodoxy said, yes, I support that. Only about 3 or 4% in the right wing supported it, but a huge percentage. That's actually the issue that had the most variation from left to right, going from 60% to about 3%. That is really the challenge. That's the biggest challenge for modern Orthodoxy. I sometimes show a picture of a toy that I loved when I was a kid. You might be familiar with it. I'll show you the graphic. If any of you know what this is. I can tell you that it's resilient because you can make it into a ball and it bounces. You can play with it. You can stretch it, and if you stretch it carefully, it stretches. But if you pull it too hard, it breaks. Anyone know what it is? Silly putty. We're kind of silly putty. We're resilient. We're stretching. We are stretching more than we ever have in terms of the views from left to right. And if we do it carefully with some intelligence and slowly and with sensitivity, that's fine. But if you pull it too hard, it breaks. I think that's going to be the challenge for modern Orthodoxy in the next generation.
I want to just add, I 100% agree with what Mark said. I want to say that I think that, just looking at the trajectory of modernity and being a Jewish historian who specializes in American Jewish history, I see that the modern moment that we have been in since the 1960s, let's say, has posed a lot more challenges to synthesis, a movement that is trying to synthesize modernity and tradition than society had posed before. 19th century modern culture didn't push the envelope. I mean, maybe they thought they did, but compared to the way we are pushing it today with respect to women's issues, with respect to LGBTQ issues, with respect to those inclusion issues, the dignity of the individual, those issues were not in the same way at that time in the 19th century or in the early 20th century or in the mid 20th century as they are today. And as the outside world becomes more evolved with respect to those issues, it just becomes more and more difficult to synthesize. And I think that is our greatest challenge. Our greatest challenge is that modernity or post-modernity or whatever you want to call it now is no longer what it once was. And we're still trying to make that synthesis happen. I think we can do it. I love that silly putty image and I think it's very apt. But I think that's kind of the main struggle that we're facing right now.
Before I give my answer to the question, I just want to start by saying that it's always nice when data confirms one's own intuitions. I've been saying for a long time that based on my experience with high school students and young adults in the modern Orthodox world, it is very clear to me that modern Orthodox young adults are much more troubled by the treatment of LGBTQ people in our community than they are by the treatment of women. And that is striking to me, interesting, and demands some explanation. And so I think Mark stated that there is more acceptance, even all the way to the right of the modern Orthodox community, of LGBTQ integration than there is of some kind of clergy-adjacent, clergy-ish, clergy-like role for women. Confirms that our community is actually more comfortable with maintaining the status of women than it is with maintaining the status of LGBTQ people. And I think that is a giant thing that needs talking about, studying, and explaining. So now I will just leave that there. But that's actually connected to what I see as a crying need. I never, the biggest challenge, the biggest issue, the biggest problem, who knows? But here's something that I see as a crying need. This challenge that we're all talking about, which is the values of the contemporary Western world, which are our values, and they are fundamentally egalitarian values, and we have all imbibed them, right? Pose an enormous challenge to orthodoxy, because orthodoxy is not egalitarian. It's not egalitarian about sex, and it's not egalitarian about sexual orientation. It's not egalitarian about gender. It's not egalitarian about Cohen, Levi, and Yisrael. It's not egalitarian about a lot of things, right? It's not egalitarian. And we desperately need someone or someones with a broad base of knowledge, with a deep understanding of the contemporary world, with an ability to speak in the idiom of people in the world today, and to help them craft that synthesis. And I don't feel right now in the community like we have it. I feel like we have people on the ground talking to the students, talking to the young adults, talking to people trying to do it. And I feel like we have senior leadership in the community that's having a different conversation. And that to me is deeply concerning and worrying. The late Rabbi Jonathan Saxon, we just tragically lost, was the best explainer of modern Orthodoxy, both to the world and to modern Orthodox Jews, but he was explaining a different set of questions. He was explaining the questions of chosenness in a world that is egalitarian, right, about race and ethnicity. And what does it mean to see yourself as a chosen people? And his books are a tremendous resource for me and for my students, but he wasn't addressing this set of issues. And I don't know who's the equivalent voice who is. If you go back and read, this is a shameless plug, go back and read Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb's sermons. They are masterworks, and you wouldn't believe the kinds of issues he's talking about in the 1960s, and the things that he's saying about them will blow your mind that a major modern Orthodox rabbi in a major pulpit was saying these things in the 1960s. Who is there today who's doing that today? Who is aware of, conversant in the issues of the contemporary world that are roiling young people or the community today, and from a profound base of Torah knowledge and that profound awareness of the issues in the world can speak to them? I don't know who it is. I don't know who can do it. And it doesn't have to be somebody of the Torah stature of the Rav or of Aaron Lichtenstein. It just has to be somebody who really firmly is grounded in both worlds, who can speak to the idiom in both worlds, and who can address these questions, these non-egalitarianism around sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender presentation, all of these kinds of things. Who is going to help people figure out what it looks like to reach some kind of understanding and some kind of path forward and some kind of figuring out? So Laura spoke to one thing very powerfully, which is to say, we don't know. We don't have all the answers. I sure as heck don't. And if I want to look to somebody to help me get some answers, who is there right now for me to look to?
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm going to ask one final question before we turn to your questions. And this question, I don't think I prepared the panelists for this question, so we'll hear their thoughts without having them had a chance to prepare. But I'm curious, where do you see, or where do you see the modern Orthodox community in the next 5 to 10 years? What are you could be as realistic or as idealistic as you might want to be in answering that question, but where do you see this community moving in the next 5 to 10 years? Are there anything that you could say descriptively about what it might look like?
Well, I'll try to answer that question. I went to the websites of 300 modern Orthodox shuls, and just to get a sense of the community. And the one thing I found, people sometimes say to me, I don't like my shul, I don't like my rabbi. And what I tell them is I say, you know what? I don't care what your level of observance is. I don't care what interests you in terms of learning, in terms of going to shul. I don't care where you are Jewishly. The shul that's just perfect for you and the rabbi that's just perfect for you is out there. You may need to move, but it's out there. So right now there is just a huge variation of modern Orthodox shuls in terms of the people, in terms of the programs, in terms of the views of the rabbi. I expect that'll continue and continue to grow. I expect there's going to continue to be huge variation. You know, the question is, are they all going to still be viewed as modern Orthodox? And I think in the time frame that you mentioned, I think they will be. I think there's going to be. I think there's currently an acceptance that modern Orthodox shuls can be very different from one another. I do think that in the next 10 years, I think I don't know what title women will have that are connected to the clergy function in a shul. I would totally expect to have women in modern Orthodox shuls with the title of Rabbanit or Maharat. I don't know that for a fact. I think they will still continue to be viewed as modern Orthodox. And then individuals have to make a decision as to what shul they want to go to. Ultimately, the people decide the shul they want to go to. And I think there are so many people that would love to go to a shul like that. And there are people who don't want to go to a shul like that, but let the people decide. They will go to the shul they want to go to. Thank you.
I'm thinking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg right now, who she once wrote this op-ed piece in the New York Times, and I remember reading it and thinking, oh my God, she's like a modern Orthodox Jew, even though of course she wasn't. She was a very proud Jew, but she wasn't a modern Orthodox Jew. The reason I'm thinking about her is because she was such a believer in incremental change. And I think that the modern Orthodox community is a community that engages with a bit of trepidation with some of these modern issues that we've been talking about, and yet over time figures out how to deal with them. It's a very slow process, and it's not one that the community makes one cohesive decision about. There can be various sectors in the community that deal with whatever the issue is in different ways, but over time incremental change does happen, and that change generally, at least in my study of Orthodox Judaism in America, seems to happen toward the ideas of Western society and inclusion, while also maintaining, obviously, fealty to halacha and fealty to Torah learning. But I do believe that just working Yeshivat Maharat for 5 years and still being very, very emotionally attached to Yeshivat Maharat, and sort of watching the development of female clergy roles in modern Orthodoxy, I saw even over the 5 years that I was there, and we're talking about a framework of 5 years, right? Over the time that I was there, I saw already changes with respect to how the external Orthodox community viewed the idea of having a female member of the clergy. I remember when the first graduate of Maharat who called herself rabbi, it was the biggest deal in the world. I remember like Rabbi Sarah was very stressed out. What is going to happen? I think the New York Times had an article about it. All the Jewish newspapers were blowing up. It was a whole thing. And then since then, a number of the other women who have graduated Maharat have taken the title rabbi. You know what? Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Now, you could say that nobody cares because they're so treif that who cares? We're not even going to deal with them. But I actually don't think that that's the case. I think that it's just the raw reaction of, oh my God, gatekeeping is slowly over time, it's changing. I think that over the next 5 years, we will continue to see expansion of leadership roles for women in whatever ways those look in different communities who have different sensibilities about these things, but the expansion of the roles will happen no matter what. I also think that LGBTQ acceptance in the community is going to expand. I think it's expanded remarkably in the last 5 years. And we know the trajectory in American society with respect to LGBTQ community has been quite an unbelievable trajectory in terms of change from unacceptance to acceptance. I think that we're a community that engages in incremental change. It is something where we feel like we need to test the waters, we need to feel it out, we need to make sure we're not breaking with tradition, where the chain's not going to break on my watch kind of thing. And then slowly we ease ourselves into it, and different communities do it in different ways, but that's what I think is going to happen.
I agree with a great deal of what Laura said, with maybe a little bit of nuance or of distinction, of slight difference. I definitely agree about the incrementalism, and that our community, we can absorb things and take things in if we do it a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. I'm not sure that having women called rabbi, I don't think that having women called rabbis, where that incrementalism is getting us within the next 5 years. I think it probably is some kind of role and some kind of title, and holding the line that by and large in the Orthodox community, the people who are called rabbi are only men. And the same thing about the LGBTQ issue, exactly the same thing. More and more acceptance in a variety of ways, while still maintaining, for example, that a religiously sacralized marriage in most of the Orthodox community is going to stay only marriage between a man and woman. And that again brings me back to that challenge, which is, as long as we are maintaining those distinctions, even if where the line has been moved, even if there is less of a distinction, as long as we are maintaining that distinction at all, there's going to have to be somebody to speak in a compelling way about how people reconcile that with their Western values. But again, I will also say, and I say this to my students sometimes, young people burn with all the passion and idealism of youth, and they see all the truths as clearly as anybody. And that's wonderful and powerful. And it's also valuable to have middle-aged people who've been around the block a little bit. And I say to them, I agree with everything that you say, but I'd rather go slower and get there without tearing the community apart than push harder and try to get there more quickly and take that chance. And if they say to me, but then never anything gets done, I say, here's where the fact that I'm 25 years older than you is valuable, because I've seen how much has gotten done in the past n number of years. And that's why I know that nothing ever gets done isn't true. And I personally, for myself, as an Orthodox Jewish woman, would rather that we walk this a little bit more slowly and bring a few more people along with us. So what do I think the next 5 years will bring? Yes, there will be some people pushing hard. And the people who are pushing hard, by the way, just to give them credit, the people who are pushing hard will say to me, and they're not wrong, your incrementalism works because we're pushing hard at the margins. And so they're like, oh, let's give in to Rivka and her incrementalism, because if we don't do that, then look what's cutting for us, which is probably also true. So there will be still people pushing hard at the margins, and there will be a greater body of people always willing to incrementally keep moving.
I really want to thank all of our panelists this evening, Dr. Rivka Press Schwartz, Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank, and Rabbi Mark Trencher. This is one of those pandemic moments when I wish we could have a full room that could give you a proper, well-deserved round of applause. But really thank you all so much for a fascinating discussion. And we will try to tackle some of the questions that have been posted in the chat window this evening. Thank you to all of our panelists. Okay, just conferring with our team here about how we're going to answer the questions. So, and I can see that there's about, by my count, nearly 50 questions that have been asked. There's about, I think 47. So we're not going to be able to answer every single question, but we are going to try to commit to sending out some responses to some of these questions if possible. And each of the panelists is going to speak on some of the themes brought up by some of these questions that have been posed this evening. But before we start with that, I know we have an interesting exercise to jump into while the question answering is happening. I think Mark Trencher has a small bit of polling that we're going to do in this chat, like with Zoom. I don't exactly know how. There it is. It's popped up on the screen. So as the questions are being answered, you have the opportunity to answer this poll. as it's happening. But right now, I'm actually going to turn to our panelists, and each of them is going to be able to speak to some of the themes brought up in the questions here. Mark's busy with this poll right now, so I'm not going to turn to him first, but I think first let's turn to Laura, if you can. Laura, I'm going to put you on the spot to answer some of the questions that have been raised in the chat.
Sure. So I'm going to try to address the question of the boundaries of modern Orthodoxy, which many people seem to ask something about. And I'm going to start out by saying that I'm answering this question as an historian and not as a poseket. I have no interest in opining about what is beyond the pale halachically for a modern Orthodox Jew. I would hardly think that is my role. But as a historian, as sort of an observer of the Jewish community, I'll just say that I want to distinguish between institutional gatekeeping and individuals, because I think there's a very big difference there. I think that institutions, modern Orthodox institutions, sort of coalesce around a number of different central beliefs that I wrote them down while I was thinking about this. Okay, halacha is binding. There's a concept of rabbinic authority. Zionism. The secular world has something valuable to offer us. Gender roles are different, and we should work with non-Orthodox Jews at least up to a point. And I think that institutions coalesce around those ideas, and whenever an institution seems to be problematizing one of those ideas, for example, what exactly is a different gender role? Can we sort of play with what we traditionally have thought the gender roles are? When we say halacha is binding, what is the actual halacha on a particular issue? When we say rabbinic authority is one of our central beliefs, who are these rabbis? Who has the authority? When we talk about the secular world having what to offer us, where do we decide what ideas from the secular world are appropriate and where do we decide which ones are not? So I think that the gatekeeping issues that the modern Orthodox community has, and there are many, and there are lots of fights about it for this tiny sliver of the community, I think that they arise out of defining these central beliefs that being a modern Orthodox institution embodies. I think for individuals, as all three of the panelists tonight have mentioned, I think that individuals really, there aren't so many gates around individuals. I think that people have all different types of beliefs and practices and thoughts about what modern Orthodoxy is and isn't, and they're part of modern Orthodox institutions in every which way and in every way that they want to be. And I think that that's appropriate.
Thank you so much, Laura. Rivka, we're going to turn to you now to answer some of the themes that you saw coming up in the questions.
In the spirit of this evening, where we've been tackling the biggest and most vast questions in the most compressed amount of time possible, I'm going to do about a sentence and a half each on two different topics that need a lot more than a sentence and a half. And I'm not sure when or in what context the conversations we followed up. The materialism topic, which I know is also going to be addressed in the next panel. I just want to say one thing about this, that it is very clear that some of what we attribute as the cost of a modern Orthodox life are in fact the cost of a certain kind of upper middle class or lower upper class stratum of American society life. And the way that I know that is because there's been loads of stuff written about the uncarryable burdens of private school tuition and summer camp and everything else that are written not in the modern Orthodox world. And you can find articles in the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg Business Week or the New York Times about families that are choking to death on $500,000 a year, and they sound like they're being written in our community, but they're not being written in our community. And there are all kinds of books right now. Daniel Markovitz, who's a law professor, just wrote a book about the costs of meritocracy. Chris Hayes has a book about meritocracy. About this entire system that we've set up doesn't work even for the people who supposedly succeeded in it. And I actually think that a lot of the modern Orthodox experience is reflective of that rather than of something distinctively modern Orthodox. Okay, enough about that. Fascinating to me to see someone in the chat who feels like the modern Orthodox community has no space for conservative voices. I think many of us living in the modern Orthodox community, that's not our experience of it. I will say two things, which I hope nobody will like, because if people will like what you say and you're not doing your job. The first thing is you have to accept, if you believe that there are a lot of different Jewish values in play here and different people can interpret them differently, then you have to accept that some people's reading of Jewish values may lead them to support political positions, platforms, parties different than the one you support, even ones that you find very difficult to understand how anyone could support them. Because Judaism does not neatly line up either with the Democratic Party platform or the Republican Party platform, it just doesn't. Having said that, it would be good if we could say, my Jewish values are complicated and in the end, this is where I come down, rather than ending up in some sort of fandom in which we act like some particular candidate is the realization of all the Jewish people's hopes and dreams and the Messiah come to redeem us. That's different than saying, having weighed the various competing values here and making a very complicated decision. And with all the factors in play, I feel like this is the side I have to come down on.
Thanks so much, Rivka. We have about four minutes left, I think. And Mark, I know there were a number of statistical questions that were asked about your research. I'm wondering if you could try to condense some of that into just a few minutes of answers.
Sure. So I noticed a number of the questions dealt with Baalei Tshuva, people who did not grow up Orthodox, but became Orthodox. I decided there's a lot there. I decided that in 3 minutes, I can probably cover a few highlights. We asked people, why did you become Orthodox? The number one reason people gave was they were attracted to it intellectually. Now, I'm telling you this because in a separate survey, we asked people who grew up Orthodox, why did you leave? These are people who grew up Orthodox and went off the derech, they left Orthodoxy. And except for modern Orthodox women, who most often said they objected to the role of women, all other groups in modern Orthodox and in the Haredi world said, I had questions, I had intellectual doubts, I was unable to ask my questions, I was unable to get answers, and we forget that these kids are very smart and deserve an answer. So to me, it's interesting that what attracts Baalei Tshuva to Orthodoxy is intellectual attraction of our huge theology and philosophy and our body of knowledge. At the same time, people leave because they are also questing and inquiring intellectually and don't get answers. The Baalei Tshuva are on a continuing journey. We did a survey and have a snapshot in time of people who are modern Orthodox, but a lot of them continue to journey. A lot of them have used modern Orthodoxy as kind of a way station on the way to Neo-Hasidism, or to even more, become yeshivish. So there's that constant flux that I mentioned. The last thing I'll mention about the Baalei Tshuva is we asked them, are there any things you've held onto from your life before you were observant? And one person said, so I'll give you a few of the odd answers first. One person said, yes, I've held on to my sense of humor, which to me was a little bit depressing. We do have a body of humor in Judaism. Another person said, I'm still a Mets fan. I believe being a fan of a sports team, even a team that loses every game, is acceptable. But the thing that people said more than anything else was they said, I've held on to the liberal social views and political views that I had before becoming Orthodox. I think, especially in the current environment, we do know that within modern Orthodoxy, there is a much more of a mix of political views between Democrat and Republican than there is in the Haredi world. The Baalei Tshuva are a key component in that. So they are a very different group. They do feel welcomed in Orthodox community by a very, very significant percentage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again to all of our panelists for a very rich, fascinating discussion. Like I said, we're going to talk amongst ourselves and see if we could send out some additional answers, because there were so many amazing questions asked in the chat. So stay tuned for that. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Rabbi David Schwartz.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Eitan Cooper. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you again, Rabbi Cooper, for serving as moderator. Thank you to Mark Trencher, to Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank, and Dr. Rivka Press Schwartz. Really an amazing panel. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to all our participants who engaged tremendously in the chat. I hope that you found the chat as entertaining and as interesting as I did, and as thought-provoking. A number of the questions that were raised, both in connection with questions of inclusion and questions of finances and the like, some of the challenges that modern Orthodoxy is facing are things that we're hoping to address in a program that will hopefully take place sometime early part of next year. So please keep an eye out for that. And at least for right now, we figured we'd give everybody a chance to get something to drink, maybe something to eat, and we'll take a short break, and we will be back in approximately 3 minutes. So thank you all very much, and we'll be back with the second panel shortly.
עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום